Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. Today, we're talking about leadership. What does it take to lead well? How do we encourage leaders in our organisations? Someone who might know is Pradeep Jeyaratnam-Joyner from Aspire Leadership, a B Corp leadership consultancy who run a range of training on all aspects of leadership, management and communication. Lots of interesting topics to get into. Pradeep, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Pradeep, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
Every time I keep saying a little bit radical to other people, part of me goes, I'm not radical, am I? And I guess for me, something about the things that I stand for and Aspire Leadership stands for and the stuff we're working on in terms of leadership, I hope isn't that radical. I hope it becomes actually mainstream. I hope that actually what I say is sort of everyone goes, oh yeah, that feels just like common sense. So it doesn't seem that kind of out there. I grew up in Stoke, and the thing about Stoke is it's a very interesting place in that when I grew up there was a South Asian community. I'm from a South Asian background. My parents are from Sri Lanka, but it wasn't as big a community as there was, say, in somewhere like Birmingham. And I was into the arts, and there was an art scene in Stoke, and there still is, but it's not as big an art scene as, say, somewhere like Manchester, and both are like within an hour of each other. So you have this sort of points of difference, and it wasn't like that, oh, I was the only person and in this sea of other people, but it was a sort of little enclave, and got me thinking about kind of how we treat difference in the workplace, how we lead through difference. I mean, yes, I was thinking about that when I was 5. No, that's certainly developed my thinking. And I think the other part of Stoke is one of those places that, and I went through a real period where I almost resented this. There, people do know your name. They do know who you are. It is that sort of people want to chat with you in a shop. And I'm a little bit like, take my money, give me my things and let me go. Now, though, looking back, I go, okay, there's something there about human relationships that's quite important to me and important to the work I do. So yeah, it's in hindsight, I go, okay, those are the things that are sort of sowed the seeds. They're always seeds, aren't they, on this journey? Every trainer makes it, every training consultancy says it's a journey. So I'm going to say journey a lot through the course of our conversation.
Very welcome to say journey, Pradeep. It's resonating a lot with my own upbringing, the way growing up in Loughborough between Leicester and Nottingham, both with far more vibrant everything than Loughborough did, to be honest. What you're describing there sounded very much just like being a typical teenager, like leave me alone, But then you two, I like you, have come to appreciate what I grew up with and some of the very tight-knit community elements, like, my best friends who I went to school with. As soon as we left school, I was like, well, don't need you anymore. But then soon enough, we were all back together and they're now like family. And you also, like me, trained to be an actor, is that right?
Yes, I did. I end up saying to people a lot that all actors are amateur psychologists. We're storytellers and we're just interested in how other people behave. And there's a kind of well-worn track in terms of people who were in sort of the arts going into corporate training and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have done things like corporate role play and, like being on the receiving end of that. And I used to do that.
The receiving end is a great way. I remember doing my corporate role play and being like, oh, 2 years ago, I was in auditions with you for Wicked, Yeah.
I once was the role player, and the delegate I was working with was someone I'd gone to school with. And then, they'd gone to university, whereas I'd gone to drama school. So we just had this sort of proper sliding doors of like, oh, this is where you've ended up and this is where I've ended up. But I think I am really interested in storytelling and stories. And the work I do is really about stories we tell. What do we tell ourselves? What do we tell our people? What are the organizations' stories that we work with? I think the other part of that, in jumping back to kind of the childhood thing, is the interesting things is that this idea that wisdom and leadership can come from anywhere and knowledge can come from anywhere. 10 years ago, if you and me had been saying to people, oh, we're trained as an actor and now we're doing what we do, I think people would have been a bit like, oh, you gave up, did you? And now people just go a little bit more, just go, oh, right, okay. That makes sense. Because the idea now that you make these sort of moves into different areas and actually that kind of transferable skill moves to a different place and life takes you in a different way seems a lot more kind of accepted in a lovely way. But I think it also then means that, it's certainly in the work we do at Aspire, it's about where can we learn from each other in lots of different ways. Leadership doesn't just have to come from the top. Leadership doesn't just have to come from certain job titles or backgrounds. It can come from anyone. So, but yes, my first ever acting job was the police had got rid of their height restriction for being a police officer. And I mean, obviously, those of you listening won't know that I'm 5'2". You can probably tell from my general demeanor, there's a short man wanting to talk right now.
The beauty of podcasts. We've no idea how tall you are.
Yeah, I'm actually 6'8". So this whole advert was basically about the fact that you could be a cop and be 5'2", except when I arrived, they didn't have a uniform that fit me. They had to cut up a uniform and sew me into it.
I think you've put your finger on something there that being an actor, having that experience gives you, which is you go through some pretty humiliating experiences. And you come out the other side, you learn to deal with rejection, you learn to be humiliated and that you can be resilient against that. And you also, I think, through the training process, see what you think about this, you explore yourself and your kind of limits a lot more than I think people who've not had that kind of experience do.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
I'd absolutely agree with that. You get to know yourself in good ways and bad ways in a very different way to maybe some of my contemporaries had. I think the other part of it is you mentioned that sort of resilience in your own limits. There is a sort of, I think in that kind of dynamic of, say, if you're making a play, the director is kind of going, how do I get these people to do what I want them to do? But actually I won't be there with them. Like they're going to be off on stage. Right. So really they could do whatever they want, but I want them to do what I want them to do. And then equally, while we're on stage, we are in this crucible of like, everyone's looking at us. How do I get to express myself and still do it in a way that, Rob, who's in the scene with me, doesn't go, what is just happening? Or it doesn't lose your thread. There's something about the way you have to interact with other people and care for other people. But at the same time, you have to bring something to the party because you can't just go, right, I'm not going to express myself because that's what you're getting paid for, right? So I think there's knowing yourself, but then also knowing how you have to interact with other humans in a different way.
That's really good. Yeah, I'd never thought about that. I really agree with both those points about how directing is about kind of enabling. And actually, as a leader in a business, we're actually should be enabling, helping people come up with their own ideas and their own ways of working and feel empowered to do that with some guidance. And then I think you're right. You can't have any passengers in a play. You all need to, I know spear carrier was a bit of a joke, but even the spear, everyone needs to show up. Yeah, that's really good. Well, let's move on to your work now. So tell us a bit about Aspire Leadership.
So we are a London-based training consultancy. We do lots of work with lots of different clients. People usually ask us what kind of clients do we get, and I think we're very lucky that we get a lot of different industries working with us. I think the commonality, you mentioned at the top, we're a B Corp. The commonality is that when people come to us, they are looking for a kind of people focus. Our stuff is basically communication, how people interact in the workplace, and making the workplace a nicer place to be. I love the fact that you just used the word enable, making it an enabling place to be. And that's something that I think is very important to all of us. There's only about 20 of us. We're sort of small, but we do a lot of work and we do a lot of projects that are a lot bigger than our size. But it also means that we know each other really well. And, that sometimes means it's tougher because we're rubbing up against each other. But it also means that you've got a group of people that are very passionate about the way we work. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. I mean, it does in the sense that I hope that we're all doing good in the world. But I think whatever you're doing, people spend an inordinate amount of time at work. And it takes up a big part of their life and their time away from their family and whatever that is. So I think there's a sort of incumbency on us as leaders to then make the time that they are spending and sacrificing pleasant. I don't understand the kind of idea that, like, you know, you should be ground by work. That just feels like a very sort of odd choice that we've decided as a society to do that. So that's what we do.
Talk to us a bit about the landscape of leadership in business, because it strikes me that it's always kind of going through changes, but it feels like particularly in the kind of the last 10 years, there's been quite a big change in generally the approach to what good leadership is, what leadership looks like. Tell us a bit about the sort of state of play, the challenges that we're facing, but also sort of the opportunities that there are in the world today.
I think there's an odd kind of thing happening with leadership. On the one hand, leadership in the public domain is becoming much more kind of didactic, much more kind of, this is my way of going. I mean, obviously, we're saying this after the American election and the results there and things like that. And there's a very definite view of how people should lead. And
Trump wouldn't strike me as someone that you hold up as a case study for.
No, he doesn't come up a lot. So, interestingly, my colleague Jess and I were running a leadership course on the day of the Trump election. The first time back in 2016, the results had come in overnight, and we spent an entire day talking about ethics and leadership. Values, you've got to have values as a leader.
Man.
And then
and Hillary Clinton had just been beaten by Trump. Yeah.
And everyone came in and was like, you know what you were saying about ethics and leadership? And we like, so, that was a moment.
Sure.
I think one of the interesting things is that we've got that narrative in the public domain. In my experience talking to leaders, is that's not the challenges that they're actually facing on a day-to-day basis. Because the day-to-day basis challenges are much more about, and I'm going to come back because I love the word that you brought up, enabling people. The day-to-day basis challenges are, well, okay, actually, it's not about my way or the highway, you're fired. It's about how do I create an atmosphere? How do I create a culture where people can do their best even if they're stuck at home because there's been a pandemic, even if they're working hybrid or have to come back into the office and are feeling a bit begrudgy of it. How do I get them to work their best when actually now as a lead, I am being asked to comment or, you know, the organization to talk to events outside the work sphere that you might have gone, well, actually, that's a thing, but actually that affects us and we affect that, you know, and then how do I do that when actually now I'm always being asked to do more with less and under a bit more pressure? I know the podcast, you've got the kind of you and then work and then sort of world. And I think there is an element, and we've actually got a senior leadership program that we called Core Culture Community in a similar kind of format, that actually there are sort of deep personal challenges in being able to get the headspace to be strategic, organizational challenges to really get people to thrive and get a workplace culture that works for everyone. And then kind of, how do I respond to the world? This is going to sound flippant, but it's not meant to. Even if I was a business leader who didn't believe in climate change, my business has to have a position now on where we stand with climate change. So I still need to respond to the world, even if I don't agree with the things coming to me. Like, you know, I have to be aware of that kind of interplay and that sort of bigger system. And that's what kind of we hear clients coming to us, and not just clients. I feel like it's my friends who are in leadership positions, or I'm in a leadership position, you know, are struggling with the same thing. And that seems very different to the I'm right, you're wrong. This is the way we push, you know, let's grind people down, going back to my sort of workplace accent. And so I think there is an interesting challenge in what's in the public sphere isn't actually what the challenge people are facing.
My own personal hardest leadership challenge, I think, is that sometimes things are hardest when things are going well. If you've got just loads of projects, loads of work, and the business is growing fast and you're hiring people, and ultimately, you know, at the top level, that is a good thing. That sometimes can be the hardest thing for the people. You must meet leaders in that position. How would you go through this process, your core culture community? How does it work in practicality when you work with clients?
I guess there's kind of 3 stages to it. And I like what you're saying about it's hardest when you're doing well, because I know nothing about sport. I am told and I understand, and my colleague Ian at Aspire is a sports psychologist, I understand it is harder, arguably, if at the top of your game to get better than it is that if you're at the bottom of your game to get average, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Like,
rubbish to good rather than good to great.
So I think there's a couple of things. So I think on the core level, there's something about how do we create space to move up from all that day to day. You mentioned project after project. We've got so much going on. I've got this, I've got that. I've got client meetings, I've got meetings. How do I give myself space to actually think a bit broader? And that's one of those things that I feel like is really easy for someone like me to go into an organization and say, you need to take space, and incredibly
just take days off.
To do. Yeah, just do it.
Just book half a day of thinking time in the calendar. Yeah.
So I think there is almost a kind of like challenge to our personal habits, just as we would say we would make time for our own physical or mental health, and, people acknowledge that. How do we kind of create space to kind of really make sure that our leadership health is healthy? So I remember once I was doing a rushing from meeting to meeting, and Liz McKechnie, one of our directors, said to me, actually a lot of my time as a leader is spent thinking about stuff, sort of thinking ahead and just...
What?
Yes. And I was like, but I need to keep moving, and I don't know whether that's, the actor in me going, but I got to hustle. I got to be out there. I got to be doing the thing, rather than going actually center. So I think the core bit is actually, how do we center ourselves? And there's a kind of practical challenge on that. But I think there is also an emotional challenge in that sort of knowing ourselves, knowing where our triggers are, knowing where our buttons get pushed as a leader. I mean, on a very simple level, knowing the things that if someone says it to me will make me go, okay, I'll do that, rather than go, am I the right person to be doing this? Let me just respond rather than react. So I think that sort of, that knowledge work of who am I, sort of comes into it. And there's tracks and there's wisdom that kind of come from that, like from the psychology. We got like personality styles and all that kind of thing, but even just practices like mindfulness or, just even a bit of journaling. There are things that we do and to discuss who we are. I think the next bit is sort of then going, okay, well, if that's who I am, that's what I stand for. How am I creating an environment now that will be something I am proud of in the future? There's an exercise we sometimes do that we call it retirement speech, which is what do you want people to be saying about you when you're done? Not what you think they'll be saying, but what do you want them to be saying? And what are you doing now to invest in that?
Oh, I like that. I love a visioning exercise. Yeah. It's a great thing.
As businesses and organizations, we say, look, this is our 5-year strategy. This is where we want to end up in 5 years. So this is what we need to do now in order to get there. That's a standard tool, right? So I think as leaders, there's almost kind of us going, well, what do we want our leadership to be? What am I doing right now to help me get there? What are the practices? And that leads us into, well, actually, what's the culture in my organization that I am creating? How am I getting those actors on the stage to still perform their best, even when everyone's watching them, even when I'm not there, and play their part? And like you say, not just be dead weight, but express themselves and bring their own artistry to the table. And I think there's, for me, about things about enabling autonomy, how much people can make their own choices, enabling the sort of psychological safety of being able to take risks. But I think there's also something about enabling healthy conflict and actually the ability for us to disagree and that be okay, and us to have a difference of opinion and that be okay. And if I'm going to go on my wee rant, it's that, like, actually, I think sometimes perfection becomes the enemy of good. People go, oh, I can't do this because it won't be this, it won't be that. And you kind of go, well, then we're never trying something out. We're never having a play. And I think maybe that's the sort of, you got to rehearse it and just have a go and see if it works. And then you tweak it. So there's something about, like, how do we really do that? And how do we really work with people to enable different points of view in a workplace? Because at the end of the day, I'm passionate about things like inclusion in the workplace. the most fundamental area in which we are different to each other is our ability to have different points of view and disagree.
Yeah.
And so actually, if we can work with that difference, I would argue we can work with any difference.
Yeah, and a tough one, we talked a little bit about the narrative on that in the outside world, an incredibly polarized world when it comes to your opinion, and your opinion becomes entwined with your identity for some reason. If the culture war's raging, the best example I've ever seen, I think, was just in my own work life of what you're talking about. So our co-founder Robbie, I'm always thankful to him for this, and he was the first person I'd ever worked with who I saw this from. He by his own admission is a deep thinker, often an overthinker, and that's his personality type. And so we'd come and we'd obviously need to do stuff, and he'd present something that I wanted to do to him, and he would give his opinion of like, well, I don't quite understand this. I'm not sure I'll get the right result. But by the way, I don't think that's a reason to not do it. And I'd never had that from a leader before, where they could completely disagree with what I was suggesting, but he was still going to let me do it because he was happy to be proved wrong.
Yeah, I love that. So good on him.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, well, exactly.
I'm interested that you mentioned that kind of the outside world and, the sort of cancel culture and that kind of thing, because I think there is an element, certainly I see with something, say, for example, like diversity and inclusion, there is an element to which people go, oh, but I don't want to get it wrong, so we're not going to have the conversation at all.
Yes, this must be something you deal with quite a lot with the leaders that you meet, right? They're worried, they're nervous and anxious about these topics, right?
Yeah, rather than just actually going, like sort of saying to them, oh, can I say that to this person? I'm like, well, I think they'd appreciate you asking the question than never asking the question. There is a big difference between people who say, how do I pronounce your name? Let me try it. But I also remember back in Stoke, there would be people who saw my name and go, oh, I'm not going to try that because I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And for listeners, because this will be edited, I'm going to come clean. That is a direct reference to me reading out Pradeep's name at the start of the podcast. But I
did get Rob's name wrong as well.
You did.
I've been calling him Dave for about an hour now.
Just best to be honest about that, isn't it? Your surname is not one I've seen before. I gave it a go, got it wrong, so we re-recorded it. And it looks like we're still friends, so that's good.
Yeah. My little bugbear that we're in this stage where actually people can't try stuff out and get things wrong, and I think sometimes people's really good intentions mean that then they're not having conversations. And especially even if I think about the riots recently in the UK, there were conversations I knew people weren't having because they were maybe a little bit tentative of like, how do I bring this up? Rather than just like, let's bring it up and let's talk about what the impact of this is. And then we can discuss afterwards, was that the best way to get it up? But, it's not a reason to go back to what your boss said. It's not a reason not to try it.
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to spend some time on storytelling because it brings us back to that, because I know that you said that's very important to you and a very important part of how you kind of deliver. How much of the challenge is actually around storytelling and the fact that there's often just sort of a communication gap between leaders and the rest of the team? And how important are stories in general in building that culture that you want, that enabling culture?
So if I was going to answer the second question first, for me, stories are absolutely critical, because stories are essentially the way that we form societies and the way that we actually, since time immemorial, we have sat down and told stories to each other. The first ways we communicated our codes of ethics, our values, were through stories. It is through, and visual stories, through pictures. We first communicated to each other. I'm going to go off and hunt bison and things like that. If I'm going to recommend one thing, I would recommend the book. It's quite an old book now, but there's a book called The Gift by Lewis Hyde, which is about the nature of gift giving in society. And that links into then the nature of art in society, because art is this gift we give to each other and story is this gift that we give to each other. That's the sort of meta-philosophical bit. The key thing for me in the stories is that sometimes I think we don't explain our working out. We explain the end of the story and not how we got the story. So let me take a tiny example, because we brought up diversity and inclusion, and you and I, we chatted about our backgrounds, and so many times you I'm sure you've seen it, you'll get a casting breakdown that, back in the day, that said something like, we welcome a wide variety of applicants onto our stage and screen, or something like that. And I'm sure there are versions of this in job adverts all over LinkedIn right now, but a sentence that's about, we welcome diversity and inclusion. All right, great. Why? Why do you want me as a diverse person? Why do you want you as a diverse person out there? You've given me the end of the story, but not the beginning of the story. Is it because actually at your workplace, you really want to hear different life experiences, different people who bring in new ideas, bring in ideas you might not necessarily agree with, but still think you should try them out anyway? Is that why? Brilliant. Tell me that story. Is it because you think, actually, I serve a client base, a customer base that are diverse in of themselves, and therefore we believe our workforce should represent the customers they serve? Brilliant. Tell me that story. And so we've got a bit where I don't know, it's almost like your maths teacher when they used to say, show you're working out. Otherwise, we're just going, yeah, okay, fine. You value me, but I don't know why you value me. So for me, there's something in that storytelling of really explaining, well, what is it about that? If we have values, corporate values on our wall as you walk into reception, why are those things important to us? The word in itself is just a word. What led us here? What is it about trust that means that that's important for us as a business? What does that mean for you as a client or as an employee within this business? So for me, that's the part that's storytelling of how did we get here, rather than a sort of like, I need to tell the story of my divorce in order for you to see me as a leader. So
that horrible LinkedIn. We've all seen those horrible LinkedIn posts. Yes. Yeah, I just got divorced. Here's what I learned about B2B sales. Joke aside, I thank you for that example, Pradeep, because I think that's so good. And we've all seen, those statements, and they just kind of become wallpaper, essentially. And I think that's so good and so brave for an organization to show the working out, as you say. And I'd imagine the power of a business saying, traditionally, we have been a very white British business. We recognize that this is a problem because we are not representing our community, not representing our clients, and we're welcoming more diverse, different ways of thinking so that we can innovate to grow in the future. Thus, we welcome a diverse range of applicants. How much more powerful is saying that?
And that's two more sentences. It's not like you've given an essay, but in those two sentences, you have told a very different story about the business's level of self-reflection, of awareness of its community, of awareness of itself, than just the bland statement that you've cut and pasted. And I think there are quite a few instances. I think another one that is this sort of return to work and people should be in the office. I'm like, brill, great, okay. You think people should be in the office? You've got to give me a reason why.
Yeah.
And actually, there's no point people being in the office if actually, for me, there's no point, rather, if you just make them sit in a cubicle and stare at a screen and don't talk to anyone, because then they could
on video calls.
Yes,
on video calls with people all the way around the world. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Give them the story of what do we do here and what do you do there, and actually then work with what are the advantages of coming to the office and use them. So, likewise, what are the advantages of working from home? Let's use those.
And I feel that from very large corporations who have issued that kind of blanket come back to the office, that story's been completely absent. I remember getting so enraged when Jeremy Hunt decided to use the word creativity to justify why businesses should be returning to the office. And I was like, you know absolutely nothing about creativity. Like the man who's like systematically cut the arts throughout his government tenure. It's like, we need to come to the office for creativity. Again, just tell the truth. I would much rather they had told the truth in that. It was like, we're coming out of COVID. We're really scared about the economy. Huge part of the economy is that you all come into a city to work and buy your sandwiches and coffees, I think that'd be just a very different conversation. But you're never going to get that from a government leader, are you? Unfortunately.
Even on an organizational level, we have invested a huge amount in offices that we're paying for at least another 3 years, because that's the time of our lease. So we better use them.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah. We feel we can use them in a really productive and impactful way, X, Y, Z. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which also then goes back to that kind of core thing of like, then how are you taking the time? Because if you're just moving between locations and doing exactly the same thing, yes, you're helping the economy by buying prep sandwiches, but you're not really kind of taking advantage of strategically, what does this going to this place give me? Okay, there's productive, impactful things. If we want to be creative, let's make the meetings about meeting face to face and doing some proper creative thinking, not let's look or sit around, like you say, on a video call, looking at a spreadsheet that we could have all looked at home.
Let's invite our clients to come and meet the team, and we'll go for lunch with this client, and we'll go for dinner with that client, and then we'll have this workshop, and then we'll just have some general chat time, which we don't get when we're all on video calls all day. Yeah, it's intentionality, isn't it? I think that's what's often missing with these things, and people can see through it, and so it just loses its impact as well. So then you just breeds sort of cynicism and demotivation, right?
Cynicism, demotivation, and ultimately kind of a corrosion of trust. So when you start getting told you have to do something, that's when people push back and say that's not fair.
It's been a fascinating conversation, Pradeep. We must move on, sadly. Let's move on to a little bit radical world, the last part of our conversation. So we have talked about some concepts that I think would be very useful for the world, but what's a little bit of a radical idea that you would like people to get behind for the world that maybe you're not involved with on a day-to-day basis?
There's two things that I was thinking about. One, I think because we've talked about it quite a lot, you've already heard me rant about how do we disagree. And I think there is something, that is the thing that, like, if I was to wave a magic wand, I would like us all to be able to realize that people can have different points of view and people can make mistakes, and that be okay. And actually it's what we do with that after, and how we forgive and how we learn. And equally, I think if we do that, what that will allow is then there to be accountability for when people really do digress and actually don't learn from their mistakes. It's that thing of, if everything is urgent, nothing is urgent. So if everything is a cancel, nothing is a cancel. That's my kind of like little world rant. But my kind of smaller thing is I am on the board of trustees of a lovely arts charity in East London called the St Paul's Arts Trust. We run a theatre called The Space. Come to it, come see some shows. There are little charities all over the country that are really looking for leaders in governance. Lots of people think about volunteering for charity in terms of shaking a tin, and that's brilliant. We need those people. We need our volunteers. It's amazing. Lots of people think about, let's do the kind of non-executive director at a big charity and let's go to the corporate function. And there's a bit in the middle where actually those little charities also need leadership. They also need people who can like really set a vision, be intentional, to use those words, enable their staff, and they need good governance. I mean, there's stories in the news in the last couple of days, aren't there, about kind of charity governance and what can happen when a charity isn't governed well. So I would like to encourage everyone to just look for a little charity that you can give. And yes, please do volunteer and shake the tin and run a marathon to raise money, but also volunteer in a kind of in the background to give leadership and guidance and governance there, because it makes a huge difference to little charities.
Oh, that's fantastic, Pradeep. I'm going to be signing up and looking into that straight away. My father-in-law is a trustee of his local small football club's foundation. So a huge range of things that you can get involved with as well. Whatever you're interested in, there's going to be something there.
I get the alerts and stuff. Like, there's so many ads for trustees on LinkedIn. People aren't hiding their need under a bushel. It's out there. Does your father-in-law play football as well?
He does, he plays walking football now. Yeah, he's played so long his knees are gone. He'll be angry at me for saying that, actually. No, but he is. He has fallen in love with walking football, actually. He's got a really tight-knit club that he goes and plays with. But yeah, the Aldershot FC Foundation, he's trustee for. Pradeep, it's been really great to speak to you. Final question now. So if there's someone out there who has a little bit of a radical idea for a business, for their career, for something they'd like to do in their spare time, but they don't quite know where to get started, what advice would you give them?
Your network of people is a lot better than you think. We play a wee game sometimes where we say, if you needed to get a message to Beyonce, how would you do it? And, it's that 6 degrees of separation kind of thing. And so my offer would be, wherever you're starting, it can feel a bit like, oh, I'm on my own doing this. And when you reach out to people, it's surprising how much expertise, and I'm going to come back to that idea of like wisdom can come from all places, how much brilliant stuff that you go, oh, I didn't know this was a thing that was even in your wheelhouse, but actually you're amazing and you're brilliant. And suddenly we're bouncing ideas off each other. And suddenly something happens. And I'm going to show my age now because I'm going to mention Facebook, but clearly marking me out as an elder statesman in terms of social media. But people are used to kind of throwing out onto Facebook and going like, does anyone know someone who can get me a grey radiator? There's a wisdom in the hive mind. And so there's a little bit of like reaching out to people, and people are generous, and people actually want to help each other succeed in a way that I think we sometimes don't think people will do, when actually my experience is that people help each other out. And that's our experience of lockdown. That's our experiences. We are a lot more pro-social than maybe we give ourselves credit for.
Sound advice, I think. It echoes
but
what
also,
a lot of other
don't
guests
talk
have
to
said.
me. Yeah, don't talk to me.
Talk to you in a shop. Yeah.
Yeah. Just like when I say pro-social, that does not mean you should be interested in my day. Just give me my stuff and take my money.
Great. Full of contradictions, aren't we, as human beings as well, Pradeep? To the final thought. Thank you very much for giving us your time today. Great to speak to you, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much, and speak to you next time.